Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're talking about being on the embodied spiritual path, and what does that actually mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? All the beauty and crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. After a recent request from a listener to share more details on how we're actually connecting the dots between all of the amazing teachers we've had on the show, we decided to do an integration episode. Recently, we've seen so many similarities between teachings that Loch Kelly shared and those that Matt Kahn offers. They use completely different language, come from radically different backgrounds, and offer different tools. Yet when you boil it down, the overlap seems obvious. We're super jazzed about what we've been experiencing and seeing since we had the pleasure of having conversations with these two luminaries back to back. So in this episode, we're chatting about how we've been integrating the connections between their teachings on what Matt would call ego and soul, or what Loch would call ego and awake awareness, and how we've been applying that wisdom to our lives. If you're enjoying the show, you know we love it when you leave reviews on iTunes or on our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. It helps people find the show, so it's a really nice way to support us, and it just feels good to know we're not here alone. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com, and there you can subscribe to get our weekly digest. You can get all the resources we mention in episodes, and you can do us the honor of becoming a supporting member at patreon.com/blissandgrit. One last thing before we head into the conversation, just in case you're new to the show, is sometimes Brooke and I curse. So if you're in mixed non-swearing company, you may want to pop in some headphones. Okay, everyone, here we go. Hello, Brooke.
Hello, Vanessa.
For all of you listening, I just had a crazy ass week. And so I'm going to see if I'm capable of putting some really nice articulate words to today's conversation. So let's see how this goes.
Huzzah!
That's great. Get me off on a giggle start. You
sure.
know that
Why not?
always helps. Okay. So I don't know, maybe a week or so ago, I feel like since I spoke to Matt Kahn last week, I'm in a little bit of like a time abyss. Like I'm not sure. Anyway, when things happen, but maybe a week or so ago, one of our listeners reached out to me and they were expressing the desire to kind of hear our thoughts after we spoke to some of these teachers. Like, how were we integrating things and how were we making sense of them? And especially because, you know, I'm sure if many of you have listened to our conversations with teachers, if you listen carefully, the truths are often just the same and being repeated, but the language can be different. The tools can be different. So anyway, while Brooke and I try to maintain that we're not teachers on this path, but rather people going through it with you, I thought it was interesting for us to see what we could make of some of these conversations we've had lately, because Loch Kelly's was really interesting and struck a chord with a lot of people. I got a lot of feedback about that conversation. And we're recording this before we released our talk with Matt Kahn, but I'd be surprised if that doesn't get a lot of feedback as well. So that is my very long way of saying today we're going to start to tie together a couple of things that came up for us in having had the privilege of speaking semi back to back with Loch Kelly and Matt Kahn. How's that intro so far? Am I making sense?
Yeah, I'm super into it.
All right. Ooh, suspenseful. Where will I go with this? Okay. So I guess what I want to say is when I was rereading Locke's book, because I had read it twice in a few years recently, it was, I guess, in May probably. And it was right after I had been on retreat with Matt in Portland. So the second time through when I was reading Locke's book, I'm like, what I'm thinking the whole time is, holy shit, he's saying the same thing. Now, what's interesting is their language is super different. Their personalities, super different. The way they deliver information, super different. You know, and I'm sure even some of their perspectives are differing. But when you get to the heart of it, one of the things that kept resonating for me as so true is how they were looking at the ego identity and how they were looking at different dimensions of reality that we could occupy within ourselves, right? So when we heard Locke's conversation, he would talk about operating systems, and that it wasn't that the ego was a problem, but were you caught in ego identity in such a way that you were seeing the world and experiencing the world through that operating system. And that there were practices we could do to shift into the operating system of what Locke called awake awareness. Well, if you listened to Matt Kahn's talk, you heard him also talk about the ego and the ego identity. And then you heard him mention the soul and how, depending on whether we're seeing the journey through the ego's perspective or through the perspective of the soul, we're going to have a completely different experience. So to me, that was like same, different lens. And in both cases, completely revelatory, because I can't remember if I've hammered this home enough in the last few talks, but this whole thing where you recognize when you're seeing and experiencing the world through your ego survival mechanism versus through your soul or awareness, that's game changing.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And one of the things about both of them that I love too is that they can point out a couple of things. They'll point out these different dimensions of reality. So whether we'll say ego perspective and awake awareness perspective, or ego and soul. And they don't do so with the need to wage war against the ego. Mm-hmm. There's no duality, which is funny because it's like I have this great opportunity to sit with, go on retreat with, read, talk to many different spiritual teachers. And some of them are still caught in that, make war with, or kill the ego, split off the ego. The ego's the bad one. The ego is what's holding us back. The ego is what's wrong with humanity. And it just gets you nowhere, so that both Locke and Matt have this way of talking about it as this very normal part of us that doesn't go away. And of course, Amodama spoke about that as well with us recently, like that it's in some ways, like if you think about, if you know as a young child that you're going to become an adult, which we do, like you wouldn't shame yourself for being a young child or like try and do all the right things to become an adult. And like the way that both of them use these kinds of normal developmental containers to talk about this, I think is just so helpful because it immediately disrupts any kind of war making, meaning the ways that we would shame and blame ourselves for like, I can't believe I'm seeing things from the ego's perspective. Again, I'm better than this. I've had big, important realizations. I've, spent 6 months of my life total in silent retreat. If I add it all up, I haven't. I'm just saying, if we were going to like create all of the stories about how we should be the evolved one. And, I'll speak for you and I, Vanessa, and I'm sure that plenty of people listening are also at this place where you'll spend large periods of your life at this stage in what you and I, when we're talking to each other, call heaven, that you're really seeing from the perspective of the soul. And that even if there are problems in the world out there and pain and suffering and And all of those things are still there, meaning it's not the bypass of the like, it's all great. So not that person. Like you can still see the world, but it's just a totally different perspective on things. And then there can be periods of purgatory and there can be periods of hell, and that these things vacillate. So if you're somebody who has spent, like you and I have spent, periods of time, like really living from awareness or really living from the soul, when that gets densified again and you go back into ego and you're seeing the world through ego and life gets a lot more painful again and the nervous system gets really riled up again, we don't have to make it the problem with us that we haven't achieved the great end game of spirituality, which is like endlessly seeing 100% of the time from the soul and being totally trigger free, totally wound free, that suffering just doesn't touch you. And like, you know what? I think that space probably exists in people, but I think that we put that through the lens that we have culturally of crossing finish lines and self-improvement, that we need to better ourselves and we need to be the good ones. And it just becomes this way of waging war internally. And actually the process of evolution is just, we have to see it kind of from the perspective of eternity. Like we're here having human lives for a reason. I don't know why. It's the mystery, but I know that I'm a human being, right? Like that's not a mistake that I'm here in a human life. So I don't need to make it a problem that I have human experiences, which are seeing and experiencing my life from a variety of different vantage points of awareness. And I just love that both of them are so skillful about keeping it out of a place where we can turn against ourselves, shame ourselves. Why haven't I achieved the great whatever enlightenment, or, what's wrong with me that I would ever experience things from the perspective of the ego? And that it's not about the lightning bolt from God, that Loch and Matt are both talking about a process of shifting, and that the maturation of consciousness in any individual is just the ability, in Matt's words, to co-create our subconscious minds. In Loch's words, to shift into awake awareness, that we can have some skillfulness about that. So I think that it's really funny actually how it worked out. I forgot that we saw Matt, knew we were going to be prepping for an interview with Loch, and then spoke with Loch, and then we didn't know we were going to be speaking with Matt because that kind of came up quickly, and then we're speaking with Matt. So for whatever reason, we've had them club sandwich together. And they do have really different language, but they're very great, skillful teachers pointing at things in really similar ways.
Yeah, experiential truths, right? It's like you can see they both speak from experience, and then they try to apply skillful language to describe the experience. And I love what you just said, Brooke, because it is nice to just recognize this maturational development, and also to recognize that there's no I in there that I have to improve. It's almost like that dualism of there's a good I that has to improve the bad I, and all of that conversation. And Matt had said something to the effect of, like if you were to tell a child everything they needed to know about being a happy, healthy human, you still couldn't make them mature faster.
Right.
But you could change their experience. They could have a lot more fun along the way. And I think that's just a lovely way of pointing to what other spiritual teachers may call grace. It's like, yeah, we're not in control of this exactly. There's no I that has to figure this all out. And there is no magical step-by-step that works 100% of the time for all people in some prescribed timeline. But if we can shift our perspective and begin to hold ourselves with the energy of the heart, the energy of the soul, see through the eyes of awareness, we could have a lot more fun in the process. We can heal a shit ton. We can be a lot more liberated. And hallelujah to that. Because, when I learned Buddhism, so that was my first love spiritually, and I started studying, and the Buddha has 4 noble truths. And the first truth is life is suffering, right? And then he goes on to say, but you don't have to suffer. So what's up with that? Mm-hmm. We know some of the suffering is people die and people get sick, and that's not really in our control. It's not what he was talking to when he said, or speaking of, when he said, you don't have to suffer. He's speaking of the suffering in our minds, right? And I've always known that. And I was always quite aware of the suffering in my mind. But it's all so much more interesting when you've then been free of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So in these moments that, for all of you listening, that you're calling heaven, Brooke, and I call too when we're talking to each other, what we're describing is being free for some period of time of the pain that comes through experiencing the world through the confined dualistic view of our survival strategy. Or we could say the pain that comes through seeing the world through our conditioning. Right. Mm-hmm. And it is just totally different, because now on this side of it, I'm like, oh my God, that's not reality. I mean, before when I'm reading the Buddhist Noble Truths, you're like, okay, yes, I get it. Right. We can control our thoughts. That's how I'm thinking about it. We'll just control them, or stop negative thinking and stop thinking bad about yourself. You're just like, okay, I get it. Right. So, but it's still coming from the ego perspective. It's still coming from this sense of dualism, and it's coming from this sense of good eye and bad eye. And good eye is getting all the teachings, and it's going to make bad eye into amazing eye. And then finally, I will be deserving of bliss and love.
Exactly. I'll be worthy in the eyes of the world.
Yes, I will have earned my way into heaven, mm-hmm. and ta-da. And until I experienced the shift into this other operating system and was free of some of that contraction, though it has returned, you'll all be pleased to hear. No, you won't. I'm just kidding.
Everyone's just licking their chops. Tell me your terrible story.
I don't even know why I said that. It was just a funny thing to announce. So it came out funny. But, as I've experienced that, then you start to get it on an experiential level, that it's not about stopping the way you think. It's not about stopping the way you feel. It's not about forcing yourself to see the world a different way. So let's say I'm grappling with feeling unworthy. It's not about just telling myself every day, you are worthy. Don't think that way.
Stuart Smalley.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. It's great. Try it. But it never creates a lasting change. Mm-hmm. And it's the first time I really started to notice. I've noticed different lasting changes over the years, like not taking things personally as much. There have been changes, but this is the first time as I learned to, or I don't know, as I shifted out of the operating system of my own conditioning, where you're like, holy hell, there's a real thing where I don't have to be trapped by that, mm-hmm. where there's actual freedom and where I actually can live from here. And then you take that perspective and you go back, apparently, and you see where you are still stuck.
Yeah.
Da-da-da-da.
I've always
through new eyes.
Yeah, but through new eyes. I've always thought of this process as being like labor contractions, that there's an opening and there's a contraction, and that it just alternates for, I don't know, maybe forever, maybe unlike birth. At a certain point, the contractions get less and less. I don't know. But I'm thinking of one of my biggest realizations, which just landed. Again, just to underscore, it wasn't because, it was after I had done, 10 hours in a row of sitting in meditation, and I sat stock still, and I had the right picture of the right guru and the right mantra. And it wasn't because of any of that. It wasn't because I earned my way to a realization. Just for whatever reason, through grace, I had this realization in movie theater that the question, will it work out, doesn't make any sense. Like all of a sudden that question, which had dominated my entire life, will it work out, and still dominates my life quite frequently. But in that particular moment, it seemed crazy. It seemed like the craziest question to ever ask. Will it work out? What does that mean? For who? Based on what? What do you mean? And it was hilarious. Like swollen shut eyes from laugh crying. Hilarious. Like what? And the amount of freedom to not have to orient from will it work out, that instead of, so what is replaced, right? Like if the question, if the lens that you're looking through on the world is will it work out? I hope it will work out. Will it work out?
Is it working out?
Is it working
this
out?
working out?
I hope it goes great. I hope I get what I want. I hope I get my needs met. If that suddenly goes away, the only thing that's left is just, this is just what's happening. And what I discovered in that place, for however long it lasted, I can't remember in calendar terms anymore, but was like, even if it was a terrible thing, there was something so delicious about it because I could experience it with nothing in between me and it. It felt like there was this barrier that was gone. Actually, it happened right before Trump's inauguration, which was, for me, a very big deal. The election sent me into all kinds of PTSD spirals, like in bed, shaking uncontrolled. I didn't do great with the news that he was going to become our president. And then I had this big opening leading up to his inauguration. So I could watch how different, because I got to experience his inauguration through the perspective of the soul. I didn't have the question anymore. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Will it work out? Won't it work out? Is it going to be okay? How's it going to go? For whatever reason, it was like something had gotten zapped in my brain. I had some micro stroke and the ability to see through that lens was gone. And it was just pure freedom, even with not in a like la-di-da, I don't care, which is like the bypass that a lot of people do. It was more just like my heart was wide open for all of humanity. And it was like, I don't know. It was like this joyous and anguished, but still pleasurable. I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why the species is going through this. I don't know. But like, for some reason, I was in contact with love. So to have that experience of like seeing through the soul, if I hadn't had that experience, which is totally tangible, it's not subtle, it's not confusing. Of course, I would tell myself not even stories. I hate that line. I need to stop saying that line. Of course, I would strategize for the sake of trying to help myself, we want to make it really basic, like help and preserve the organism. Of course, the ego would go, how can I? How can I get over there? How can I do a better job? What's wrong with me that I don't understand? That the question, will it work out, doesn't make any sense. I know I'll fill in the blank, say my mantras or meditate longer, smile at every person I pass on the street, or not speak for 6 months, or I don't know. Like, of course, in innocence, the ego would try to put me over there, but it can't. It literally is the thing that can't go to there.
Right. It wants to go to there.
It wants to go to there, sort of, although it also wants to keep itself, because it can only see itself, because it can't go to the land of, doesn't make any sense to wonder if it'll work out. Because its job is to seek and find problems to solve. What it's going to do is seek and find problems to solve. It's its job. It's the only thing it knows how to do. In innocence.
I know.
You know, sweet, cute, cutie, you little cutie pie.
Do my job. Do a good job.
The problem is you're not working hard enough at awakening.
I think that the exploration of the questions that you were sharing with us, like how the question didn't make sense, it has been so relevant in my life too. And there are things that I've noticed that I never had the articulation for until recently, as I've been sitting with these teachers and shifting my own experience. But for example, I always used to say the question of, am I lovable? That question just falls away from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. It becomes not a very interesting question, not a very relevant one. It's like we could put all sorts of words on it, but probably the simplest way to say it is you just don't ask that question. Right. The same way as like when you've shifted into this other operating system, you don't say, what's wrong with me? Mm-hmm. It's just not a relevant question because it's not how the structure of awareness is set up, if there's such a thing as structure, but just to compare it to the ego structure. So like if we were to just highlight again some of what's come out of Loch and Matt and take a little tour of the ego structure, which sometimes I notice I'll call the ego survival mechanism, just to kind of remind us that the ego really tends to get in the game because it's trying to make things safe. And it gets extra inflamed when it perceives that things aren't safe. Dilemma being, the ego is conditioned by everyone we've ever met and the culture we've lived in. The ego only thinks in terms of problems. And so it's always looking for a problem to solve. And what is difficult about that is it tends to turn people into problems. So us or them. And the ego only sees through binary, good, bad, right, wrong, safe, unsafe, pleasurable, painful. It is kind of the heart of dualism. And lastly, it seems to only circulate the language of shame, blame, and judgment. Mm-hmm. Those seem to be its kind of like, highlights, shame, blame, and judgment. So what's really interesting is you start to take a tour of your ego, as I've been taking a tour of my ego, is you can start to get to know when you're jammed into that operating system, mm-hmm. right? Because it's funny. I mean, I think it's important when Matt highlights that you can go on a spiritual journey, and we're using those words pretty loosely, given everything is a spiritual journey, we know that, but we can embark on a spiritual journey and we could either do it through the ego's perspective or we can do it through the perspective of the soul. And depending on which lens we're using, we're either going to get more freedom or we're just going to keep showing ourselves where we're stuck. Mm-hmm. So if we come at it from the level of the ego, you'll notice it because you'll be thinking in binary. There'll be shame, blame, judgment. You'll be a problem or everyone else will be a problem, right? There's like certain telltales. So I did this like most of my life.
Yeah, we all did. Everyone listening, it's what we all do. You're not alone. It's what we're all doing.
So here we are. And I'm like doing my, loving kindness meditations, my metta practice or something. And then afterwards you're like, I don't think I did that right. Did I do that right? Am I more loving now? Am I more self-loving? I feel like they're not as loving as I am, or am I? Hello, ego. Mm-hmm. And you can tell the signs. If you've had an experience, for example, if any of you have ever been on retreat with someone like Matt Kahn, or I'm sure there's many, many teachers we could say the same, you come off of retreat, you've got a retreat high. Mm-hmm. You are blissed out, baby, right? Like everything is beautiful. And then that retreat high starts to crash over time. And then you start to think, what do I need to do to get back there? Mm-hmm. Telltale sign. You're seeing through the ego operating system.
Mm-hmm. How do I get back to the gates of heaven? What's wrong?
And there's some big I, right? Yeah. Like it's I, and how do I do it? Mm-hmm. And there's definitely going to be some step, and I'm hoping it's going to be a quick one. Even if it has to be a hard one, I'm going to take it and I want to get back to heaven and stat. And there's no appreciation for the process that's unfolding in this being. There's no curiosity about the shapes and the movements and the conditioning, and there's no ability to genuinely be present with what is unfolding in front of you that's pointing towards what is yet to be met and healed.
And that it can just be, I know you're saying this, but just to highlight it a little bit, it can just be totally okay that we go in and out of seeing from the soul's perspective and seeing from the ego's perspective, that these labor contractions are real and they happen. Because when you get pulled out of heaven and you contract into an ego state, it hurts. Like, it really hurts. So we don't need to, on top of the hurt, also layer that it's something we're doing wrong and that we should be more evolved and that we should have some secret hack into going right back. There's some reason why, and you and I keep using the phrase, there's some reason why we're taking a tour through a core wound. So we have this different level of awareness and we go back, we go back to a very ingrained pattern or belief system or trigger, all of the above usually, but from a different perspective. So we're still in ego because we contract. It hurts. We believe it. We're hooked. Our nervous systems go bonkers. All of those things happen. And there's still an awareness part that's aware you're taking a tour. Not in the fake, detached, spiritual person, because you're really feeling it. It really hurts. But that there's some part of you that's able to see with more clarity. And that doesn't mean that you have some kind of magic wand in your back pocket that you can pull out, or I haven't experienced the ability to just, wiggle my toes and shift my perspective, and even though I have great tools, like the tools that Loch Kelly was guiding us through, so helpful. Meditate. So many of the things, right? Meditation, all the, vagal nerve reset stuff I talked about last time. Sometimes and oftentimes these tools are very, very helpful, but it's still like if we're meant to go back and experience some part of our contracted patterns, that's what's going to happen, right? It's not the make it go away, magic ourselves away to the happy place, because a part of being human is that we sometimes get a really up close view. That's why we're having human lives of a certain kind of conditioning or pattern or, painful trigger. And actually, I was just watching, Matt Kahn just started his book tour, which you can buy digital tickets to, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. So I bought tickets to his first one in Vancouver, which was about healing your core wound. And at some point he said, like, what if we just change the word ego to core wound? So because we can still, even though we're like, oh, the sweet ego, oh, we're not opposing the ego. When we sketch it out in these terms, it's like, obviously, if I were going to pick one, I would not pick to live from that state. I know whose team I want to be on, and it's not team ego. Mm-hmm. So if we instead call it a collection of our core wounds, right? Then it's like, oh, that's just a part of what happens here. Core wounds get triggered, not that nasty little demon, the ego is in control again. Shame on me, shame on it, everything sucks. It's like, oh, something in my world, internally or externally or both, touched a very sensitive spot. My nervous system got riled up. I believed the place that got touched. I believed that it's the truth. Like, so maybe it's I'm not lovable, right? Like when you believe that, it hurts. It really hurts. That's a core wound. That, because it's gotten touched and triggered, if you're revisiting it, if you're taking a tour, you have a chance to get to know it in a much more intimate way. And it's not the thing that needs to be shoved away. It's so funny. I feel like we can talk forever and ever and ever, and a bajillion teachers for all of time have talked about that we don't need to make our egos the enemy. And yet it's like, because that's the operating system most of us are coming from in innocence, because it's what we're doing here. It's just, until you've had an experience of something other than that, it's just we're going to make war with it.
Well, because it hurts.
Right.
Right. It's hurting. So it's that survival mechanism that's creating that kind of contraction on us or something like that. Experientially, the voices in our head, the out of control feelings, the nervous system fluctuations, like they hurt. So we come to associate it with that thing that hurts. I think it's nice that when Matt called it collection of core wounds, it sort of depersonifies it, because we all have a habit of personifying things, right? Like we think dogs think like people, or, we always personify things. It must just be some shortcut thing we do. And it's nice not to see it as some person in there doing something for that purpose, right? Because otherwise it's almost like having, I don't know, a really annoying kid brother or kid sister or something. And it's like, you should love them, but you still wish they weren't there. Like it'd be better if you weren't here, Can almost be like tolerance at best, as opposed to seeing it as, I almost like keep getting this picture of like it's like a helmet or something with like goggles. Like it's just a certain lens. It's a conditioning pattern. It's probably somehow neurobiologically stored as some very basic heuristic models that are derived from beliefs that people have taught you about the world, right? And that when we get triggered, what it means is we go into this automatic default mode. And so all of our beliefs seem true. And we base our decisions and our feelings and our thoughts off of them. And it's almost like just putting on goggles and kind of like fake ears. And so everything about reality filtered through all the conditioned structures. And that's what it feels like. And that's why I think sometimes if you get triggered, so when we get triggered, recognizing there's this emotional piece and there are thoughts that can come with it, but also a bodily state. So when you get triggered, what I noticed this week for me, as my nervous system got triggered, was it was almost as if literally my physical body, my mental body, and my emotional body went back to the time at which that belief was created.
Yes, that's the way it felt to me too, going through the move stuff.
Right? Like even old patterns of posture that I had been resolving all came back like in an instant. Like my right shoulder dropped, my left leg did something different. The thought patterns were similar. The feelings of, so when I was little, because my house had so much chaos in it and I was such a sensitive person, I had this feeling of my parents fighting in the house and me kind of pulling the covers up over my head, shaking and trying to put pillows on top of it to make it stop. And that same sensation got reenacted. And then the thoughts that come with it get reenacted. I'm not safe. No one sees I'm not safe. I'll never be safe. I'm not safe in my house, right? So all the same thoughts, same bodily posture, same feelings of panic and terror all get brought about as that particular pattern gets triggered, which is why teachers like Kieran and Eckhart Tolle use the word pain body. It just seems to describe how when a core wound gets activated, it has certain eyes, certain ears, certain filters to perception that seem to be unique to it, which I just think is really, really interesting. So can I read a quote or two from Matt Kahn? Okay.
Of course.
Since we're bringing this all together, because just to say, both Matt and Loch believe that awareness is right there. You are already awake. They just say different language. And yet they both believe you are a human being and that there is healing to do of our conditioning and our wounding. Loch works with subpersonalities. So that's a different psychological term, and y'all can look that up if you're curious. And Matt talks about all sorts of different things, psychological perspectives. And in this case, I'm going to read some quotes about the nervous system. So Matt says in his book, Whatever Arises, Love That, when the nervous system is overstimulated, you are bound to feel unsafe in your body, unsupported by the world, lost, disconnected, unable to make wise, decisive choices, and without direction in your life. As your nervous system unwinds, your attention expands to dissolve self-doubt, to enhance your interest in listening, and to guide you toward the most inspired choices that are always in reach. So already from that quote, we get the two things. Like once you're triggered, meaning once your nervous system perceived not safe, you already shift into a whole state of being, not safe in your body, unsupported, disconnected, unclear, right? And then as that resolves, you all of a sudden have access almost to a different, well, it is to a different level of consciousness, almost to a different level of knowing, right? Like those questions don't make sense anymore, like you were describing before, Brooke. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really interesting. And then I just want to read one more, which is maybe a little more left field, but some of you may be going left field. Okay, so he was talking about when your consciousness expands, your nervous system might initially be unable to hold the vibration of this brand new frequency. If this occurs, you may notice your nervous system regenerating patterns of overstimulation. It may seem as if your consciousness that had been so expanded begins to shut down and return to the pattern of the inflamed personality that your awakening seemed to have rescued you from. And he goes on to say, as you return to the conditioned state, though, you have a chance to re-experience ego with greater consciousness. This helps you revisit unresolved patterns from a much clearer perspective. So I think there was two things I wanted to highlight in that, and I'm sure you have plenty of things you would highlight. But one is sometimes we can get triggered by even something so beautiful as our consciousness expanding. And since, we get a lot of listeners writing to us or speaking to us if we're coaching them or whatnot, that they're having some pretty powerful unfolding experiences. I mean, people's consciousnesses are shifting, and you might even go on retreat. And as that happens, sometimes an expanded state could be bliss, could be clarity, could be happiness, can be perceived as unsafe, and your nervous system can't quite handle the intensity of that vibration, and it will shut down into an old pattern. I think it's helpful to understand that. I actually think understanding can go a long way, because that's what happened to me this week. And I do think it was directly from speaking to Matt Kahn on Monday and my consciousness shifting. Then there was a series of events that followed that. But what I think happened was my nervous system went, I can't handle this. And then it just found the next closest thing to freak out about, and it shut down. But because I could understand that, I'm not saying I'm totally through it, but I know that if I didn't 3 years ago, this would have been a complete PTSD reenactment. This would have been a slippery slope into believing every story that I was telling. And then the second part is what Brooke, you were sort of pointing to before, that now when you return to that conditioned state, having been someone who can clearly know the awareness operating system, when you return to that state, you can now see it, but with greater consciousness and a clearer perspective. And that helps. That almost sets us up to now meet it with that love, meet it with that openness. Meet it in such a way that can up-level our nervous system so that we can finally be safe holding that greater, more expanded level of consciousness.
Yeah, and it puts it back in like a developmental stage as a understanding. Like we're never going to be adults who think the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, and we become actually physically, tangibly children. We know plenty of children in adult bodies. But I'm talking physiologically adult versus child, and so it makes you realize that there is no backwards, and that sometimes when we have these big shifts in consciousness, or we can call these really profound maturations of consciousness, that there's an adaptation phase, and I work with the physical body so much in my work for a long time now. And it's the thing I'm always having to tell people. Like, the adaptation phase is always longer than you think it is, just because we're in a culture that wants to be over there all the time. Over there, over there, over there, crossing the finish line. And so if somebody, you know, for example, is trying to run a marathon, there's going to be a long adaptation phase depending on that person, depending on their body, depending on their physiology, depending on their nervous system, depending on, you know, the density of their tissue, depending on their injury history. What their adaptation is going to be, meaning how do they train? How slowly do they train? What do they need to think about? What do they need to do? What needs to change? That happens over time. And we can think about this really practically about consciousness too, that there's an adaptation phase. And so we can couch it in terms, which I have, and I do, of like being in heaven and being yanked back out and thrown back into hell, or being stuck in purgatory. And those are tangible experiences. So the labels work fine, except for when it becomes the, what did I do wrong? Why am I in hell? What did I do wrong? Why am I in purgatory? How do I get back to heaven? And we can instead say like, oh my God, how relieving to be able to just have that framework of, I had a dramatic expansion in consciousness and I got triggered because of it. And so I'm back in ego. This is an adaptation phase. It's why I'm circling back. It's not because I'm stuck forever in the feedback loop or, you know, that I did something wrong. And it also just helps because, oh my God, I mean, I spent last June through November just totally lost in space. And it was right after I was on retreat with Kieran. I had this massive opening, and it was my third in a year. I had 3 big realizations, which just landed. And then my body was just like too much. And it just went into complete freeze, you know, just total shutdown. And that wasn't a problem either. It was scary. It was unpleasant. But it was also just that's what my adaptation phase looked like. Had I known that at the time, it just would have, like you said before, with Matt saying, you know, if you give this information to a child, like, it just would have made it less scary, right? Because some kind of surface tension of fear would have been removed. Because it's like, oh, this is adaptation phase. It sucks. It's painful. I do not like it. But I'm not also dealing with the stories of, am I dying? Is there something wrong with me? Am I like severely ill? Am I going to be like this forever? All of those things. Have I screwed up awakening? Have I screwed up being a human being? Am I the worst? Am I the weirdest? Oh my God. If that hadn't been there, it just would have been a lot easier. I don't know if it would have gone quicker, but it would have been more pleasurable.
Right. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate that sometimes having genuine understanding can be of support, you know, and it's hard to say that because we know the ego is always seeking to understand more, and it thinks once it gets the answers. And so it's hard to say that, but there is such a thing as having a helpful frame. And just going through what I went through this week, you know, it's the first time where maybe not the first time, but where I was really in a cranked state, like painful cranked state. And yet there was this other part of me still present that knew that it was here to help me, like Matt's book title says, that it's all okay. And that's very different because I think otherwise, you know, what you were pointing to, like we're in hell and we're trying to get to heaven. What it is not just a benevolent, like, oh, I want to be happy, which is lovely. We all want to be happy, no problem. It's like a pushing away of experience, like, no, you. I don't want you. No, you. That's what my sister used to say to my dad. And it's no, you. No, you. And it's like, it's not just a no, you. It's now I was like, wow, this hurts. This is interesting. But it's obviously pointing out to me something in my conditioning that is still active, that hasn't been healed, that hasn't been met. And just that understanding already softened it. It mitigated how deep down a rabbit hole I can go with all of those narratives. It mitigated how panicked I got. Because at a certain point, as the panic's building, you know, we can say things that increase it, or there are thoughts that decrease it. And to understand, okay, this is here for my highest good. It's okay that it's here and I'll be safe, right? It's not a problem. That mitigated some of those extreme places this could have branched off into. So I've been finding this conversation, starting with Loch, then with Matt, hopefully you all are finding this conversation with us, to be really helpful and relevant. And just choose the teacher whose language you like. Choose the teacher who you resonate with. Like, play with it or do what we do, choose them all. But this understanding is, super liberating.
Yeah.
We're so glad you joined us in listening to today's show. The show notes, including any resources we mentioned in the episode, are live at blissandgrit.com. Just go to the website, scroll down, you'll see each episode's separate post. We put the resources right in there. Our member platform, which is so near and dear to us and helps us keep going, is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. You can head over there, you could donate to keep the show going and also get rewards for your support. If you've been wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, it's a great place to go for a more immersive experience with Brooke and I. You can also just come play with us on Instagram and Facebook. We're always sharing our thoughts and insightful quotes, and we'd love to see you hanging out over there. We're so grateful for the reviews so many of you have written, for the membership support that many of you are providing, and for all of the notes that you send. It really touches our heart, and we're so honored to be here with you. Till next week, y'all.